And I'm going to introduce Ken Lawler, who is our chair of Fair Districts Georgia, and he's going to introduce our speakers for the evening. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you, Janet, and I'll add my welcome to those folks from Georgia and from other states around the country. This is a new thing for us in Fair Districts Georgia, is hosting an event that has kind of a look at the national perspective on gerrymandering and redistricting. And we are really pleased to have three of the absolute leading lights in this space work with us tonight. This program kind of grew out of some work that we did in December, looking at the results of the midterm election in Georgia. We examined the election very closely to understand what effect the new maps had on the congressional, all of our elections in Georgia. And we noted that our congressional districts basically conformed exactly to the way the map was drawn. And when the map was drawn in Georgia, we indicated to our state legislature that we thought there was one seat that was unfairly moved into the Republican column. It was clearly a gerrymander here. We talked to them about the fairest map, and we were one off the fairest map. But it raised the question in our minds is, well, if Georgia did that, what about the rest of the country? And when you look at this new Congress, we look at the new Congress here, it was a very narrow margin on the Democratic side prior to the election. I think it was a +4 or +5 for the Democrats. New maps were drawn, an election was held, a midterm election, a very consequential one. Now we have the Republicans had gained 9 seats. There's a +5 margin for the Republicans. So with the House flipping back and forth between these very close margins, the question we ask is, well, to what extent did drawing the maps affect that? Was gerrymandering in various states from both parties a cause that caused that change to happen? The folks with us tonight are going to be the best people I can think of to answer that question. So I'd like to then go ahead and introduce our panelists tonight, if we can spotlight them. Let me just introduce our panelists. So we have David Daley with us tonight. Most people who follow redistricting would know David Daley from his books. He is a senior fellow at Fair Vote. He's the author of the national bestseller, pardon my language, Rat Fucked, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. Yes, well, block yours, Sam. Which is widely credited for helping spark the drive to reform gerrymandering. And then his follow-up book, which is a little bit more upbeat, is Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. The Rat Fuck book was also the basis of the award-winning documentary Slay the Dragon. Eric Holder has called him our Paul Revere of partisan gerrymandering. That's a very appropriate title for David Daley. His journalism on voting rights and democracy has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The New Republic, The Atlantic, Slate, Washington Post, many other publications. He's been a guest on Fresh Air, frequent commentator on CNN, NPR, and MSNBC, and Comedy Central. So maybe we're going to hear some funny things from Dave tonight. David, I should say. He's the former editor-in-chief of Salon and has taught political science and journalism as a fellow at Wesleyan University, Boston College, and right here in the University of Georgia. So welcome, David. Sam Wang. Professor Sam Wang is a professor of neuroscience at Princeton University. He directs the Electoral Innovation Lab at Princeton University. Excuse me, it's an independent organization. He's an alumnus of the California Institute of Technology, where he received a BS with an honor in physics. He went on to earn a PhD in neuroscience from the Stanford University School of Medicine in 1993. He conducted postdoctoral research at Duke and then at Bell Labs, Lucent Technologies. Now, in the political arena, Professor Wang is also the director of the Electoral Innovation Lab. It's an independent nonprofit that works like a scientific laboratory to test ideas for restoring and strengthening American democracy. One of the forerunners to this lab was a thing that Sam set up called the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, which provided comprehensive benchmarking and scoring for all 50 states during the 2021 redistricting cycle, covering congressional and state legislative maps. And I'll also say a personal thank you to Sam and his team. We made great use of that data in Georgia, and it still is being quoted in the news media here in Georgia to this day. So that Forerunner project, Sam, has been a game changer for us, and I think for many states across the country. Finally, another gentleman here with us, Michael Lee, who serves as senior counsel for the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, where his work focuses on redistricting, voting rights, and elections. Michael has been with us before. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, Michael Lee practiced law at Baker Botts LLP in Dallas for 10 years. He was the author of a widely cited blog on redistricting and election law issues that the New York Times called indispensable. He is a regular writer and commentator on election law issues, appearing on PBS NewsHour, MSNBC, NPR, and in print in the New York Times, LA Times, USA Today, Roll Call, Vox, National Journal, Texas Tribune, Dallas Morning News, and San Antonio Express News, among others. So these three gentlemen really are, I think, three of the leading lights in this space in terms of redistricting and gerrymandering. And our format tonight is going to be a panel discussion. I'm going to give each of our speakers a chance to spend maybe 5 or so minutes kind of expressing their point of view on this essential question, which is, how did redistricting and or gerrymandering affect the outcome of this election? So take maybe 5 or so minutes each to kind of give your preliminary kind of statement or point of view. And then we will get into a panel discussion back and forth. And then at some point, we will be taking questions from the audience, as Janet mentioned. If you want to place your question in the chat, go ahead. As we proceed, Janet will read those questions later. If you desire to address your question to a particular speaker, you may do that, or you can address it to the panel as a whole. So with that, we're going to kick it off. And David Daley, we're going to put you up first and have you kick us off here and tell us, what do you think about this key question on the election and the redistricting activity?
Good evening. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Janet, Leslie, everyone at Fair Districts, Georgia. I'm a great admirer of the really important work you all have done to advance democracy and fair elections in this crucial state. An honor to be part of this panel with my esteemed colleagues and friends, Sam and Michael, two of the very first people I reached out to when I started working on my book. The nation is fortunate that these brilliant thinkers are at work every day to make this nation a better place. I have a feeling that the three of us see much of what transpired during this last round of redistricting through a similar lens. You wanted us to talk about the role gerrymandering played in the balance of the new House. And the short answer is it absolutely played a role. Was it the determinative role? I think that's a slightly harder question to answer definitively. Republican candidates for Congress won more votes than Democratic candidates. But I would argue that if you look at the number of seats that both parties flipped in 2022 due to gerrymandering, that the net gain for the Republicans is larger than the 5-seat 222 to 213 majority that Republicans control the House. I'll walk through this a little bit step by step and state by state, but I want to offer a handful of big picture takeaways first, just on redistricting and this last cycle. John Adams described the goal of the House as capturing an exact replica of the people in miniature, and we are farther and farther away from that goal. This last cycle was a bloodbath for the number of competitive seats, and certainly extreme redistricting contributes to the growing lack of competitiveness in our elections. The frozen maps that we're seeing, 84% of House races were won by double digits. 67%, that's 291 of 435, were won by 20% or more or uncontested. In both of those examples, that's up dramatically from 2018. The average margin of victory for a member in 2022 was 28%. The number of Americans of voting age who voted for a winner, that was down to 24% of us, the lowest since 2014. None of these statistics reflect healthy, competitive, or representative democracy. What it means is that these districts are locked for a decade, that the House is not likely to be responsive to shifts in the electorate for much of the next 10 years. I would say that congressional maps that don't reflect the nation's political balance are dangerous, but that these maps also do not reflect the demographics of a changing nation. Indeed, I'd say that many states, including Georgia, have actually used redistricting and drawn lines that hold back that change, that prevent a multiracial nation from becoming a multiracial democracy. And here, the United States Supreme Court has played a bitter and determinative role over the last decade. There's a series of decisions here that are consequential. Certainly Shelby County versus Holder in 2013 that effectively ended preclearance from the Voting Rights Act this cycle was the first in 5 decades that states that had been covered did not need to submit their maps for pre-approval. So we're talking about Texas and Arizona, Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, Alabama. Texas responded with a map that limited Latino and Black political power, even as minorities accounted for 95% of the state's population gains during the 2020 census. Certainly the maps from those states would have earned a skeptical review from the Department of Justice before being enacted. The elimination of Section 5 effectively was followed in February of 2022 by a weakening of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The court signaled that it would allow racial gerrymanders to stand when a federal court had overturned a 6-1 Republican map from Alabama, which had aggressively packed most of the state's black voters into a single tentacle-shaped district stretched across Birmingham, Selma, and Montgomery, then diluted the remaining black voters across several other seats. This is a 3-judge panel with 2 Trump appointees, found it to be really a textbook violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which had prohibited maps that discriminate on the basis of race. And even the Chief Justice, John Roberts, a no friend of the Voting Rights Act, a no friend of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, agreed. They ordered a lower court had ordered a new map with a second seat where black voters would have a fair chance to elect a candidate of their choosing. The other 5 conservative justices, however, halted the new map, reinstated the racially gerrymandered map. Earlier this fall, they heard full arguments in the case Merrill v. Milligan that could lead to a dramatic weakening of crucial Voting Rights Act's protections. This preserved not only one Republican seat in Alabama, but another in Georgia, where a federal judge said he believed the state's congressional map violated the Voting Rights Act, but decided not to act in light of the Supreme Court's action in Alabama, and another seat from a similar case in Louisiana. The Supreme Court, of course, also had the ability to establish national standards on the scourge of partisan gerrymandering in the 2019 case of Common Cause v. Rucho. The Chief Justice and a 5-4 conservative majority instead closed the federal courts to these claims, sending a clear message to state legislatures that they would be able to get away with the most aggressive lines they desired this cycle without the threat of any scrutiny. It created terrible incentives. Both parties had little reason not to draw maximal gerrymanders wherever they could. State courts might step in and declare these kinds of partisan gerrymanders unconstitutional, but that would provide little comfort in states such as Florida, Texas, and, as you know, in Georgia, where state courts have long ago been annexed by partisans. When state courts in New York and Maryland stepped up entirely appropriately and undid egregious Democratic gerrymanders, they actually introduced unfairness into the national map and undid a gross but roughly effective national balance. This really highlighted the need for national standards and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Partisan politicians can run roughshod over the Constitution and the courts and reforms passed by citizens. Florida's state constitution, as amended by a supermajority of voters in a 2010 statewide vote, prohibits redistricting that benefits or harms either political party. Instead, Governor DeSantis there rode roughshod over those provisions. When the state's Republican legislature passed a status quo map that reflected the state's red lean, the governor said that wasn't good enough, and with the help of national lawyers and operatives, jammed through a new map that awarded Republicans an additional 4 seats. The state Supreme Court, however, which had unraveled a similar partisan effort last decade and tossed out that gerrymandered map, has since been packed with loyalists. The court rubber-stamped that clearly unconstitutional map and allowed it to be used in November, to no one's surprise. Republicans gained 4 seats and a 20-8 edge in Florida. That's 71.4% of the seats in a state where Donald Trump won 51.2% of the vote in 2020. In Ohio, where 70% of voters amended the state constitution in 2018 to require a fair congressional map that does not favor or disfavor any party and accurately reflects the state's political leanings, Republican officials simply ignored the Constitution, then steamrolled the state Supreme Court when judges from both political parties attempted repeatedly to enforce it. Every time the court ordered Republicans to try again, officials submitted a map just as gerrymandered, eventually running out the clock and forcing an election to be held on a map that the state Supreme Court had called unconstitutional. Republicans won 10 of 15 seats, or 2/3, even while J.D. Vance's U.S. Senate win over Tim Ryan more accurately reflected Ohio's 53.3 to 46.7 divide. So we come back to the question, was gerrymandering a factor in Congress? Was it the factor? Yes, and I would say quite likely yes. I mean, if you want to quantify all this, you've got to look at a big picture, and it's a question of how you define gerrymandering, which I would say is really undue partisan influence that distorts the process in order to advantage one side or the other. So you have maps that were not drawn in Texas and South Carolina that probably would have resulted in 3 additional majority-minority seats. because they did not need to submit those maps for preclearance. You have maps that were not forced to be redrawn in Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana. You're potentially looking at an additional 3 to 4 seats there. Then you add together the Republican gains in Florida, those 4 seats, Wisconsin, 1 or 2, Tennessee, where Nashville was cracked in half, Ohio, Arizona, where a hardball politics and a capture of the Redistricting Commission and the absence of preclearance switched another 2 seats. The hardball process that was played with the Independent Redistricting Commission in Iowa, the erasure of swing seats in Utah, Oklahoma, and Indiana, many of which had gone blue as recently as 2018. You begin to say there's 16 to 18 seats on one side that ended up red. You've got what Democrats did in Illinois, Oregon, New Mexico, Nevada, Maryland. When you examine what the 2 parties did, how they manipulated the process, you still, almost any way you cut it, still end up way over Republican +5. There was certainly good news in this process. California worked again. New commissions in Michigan and Colorado worked well. The process in Virginia broke down, but courts provided an effective and honest backstop. But I said that there's dark clouds on the horizon, the impending decision in Milligan that could further narrow Section 2 permanently. Certainly, Moore v. Harper and the independent state legislative doctrine is going to be decided shortly, depending on what happens, certainly in North Carolina. Right now, calling into question whether courts can review maps and perhaps even the constitutionality of commissions themselves. You've got Ohio and North Carolina likely to do mid-decade redraws now that courts have flipped partisan control there, which I think is going to tilt this map even further in one direction in 2024. And you've got the continued impact of gerrymandered state legislatures, in some states entering a second or third decade. And what you see are policies that are not supported by citizens, whether you're talking about on public education or mask mandates or reproductive rights, enacted with little that the public can do. We talk about Congress a lot, but gerrymandered state legislatures are the ones often drawing these maps, oftentimes enacting voting restrictions. And if there is a reprise of efforts we saw before January 6, 2021, after the next election, shenanigans with election certification and alternate slates of electors, the crisis that could ensue there, gerrymandered swing state legislatures will be right in the middle of that. But in a bitterly polarized nation, on a maximally gerrymandered congressional map that's been frozen into red and blue districts, control over Congress in a year where the voters' verdict was essentially a tie should not come down to which side engineered itself more advantages through redistricting. And when those advantages are accrued by shredding state constitutions, weakening the Voting Rights Act, and turning the courts into blunt force instruments of partisan power, the state of American democracy grows ever more precarious. Thank you.
Thank you for that comprehensive overview. Disturbing picture, of course. So let's give the floor over to Sam Wang from Princeton and the Electoral Innovation Lab. Sam, take it away and let's hear your perspective.
Okay, thank you so much, Ken and David. That was really a perfect introduction. I'm going to say that I think that David, after long experience covering politics and taking a pretty jaundiced eye, is a pessimist. I'm going to tell you a few things about me. One is that I'm an optimist. I tend to look ahead, not backwards. And the other is I'm a really nerdy data guy. And so what I'm going to do is just walk you through some data-based arguments showing that while I would not really take issue with anything David said, I would say that there were some bright spots in the last cycle which don't get talked about. I would say that those bright spots can teach us something about what we can do about A, what happened in 2022, B, what we can do in the near future. And towards then, I want to broaden the discussion a little bit towards state legislatures. I know that we're mainly talking about congressional races tonight, but I want to talk about local democracy because I think that a lot of hope for making progress in our democracy and patching up these problems that David has identified so well in his books. I think that one needs to nurture what I would say one's inner federalist. States' rights are kind of a dirty word if you're historically minded, but actually there are ways in which states are really the only way forward for really repairing and fixing bugs in our somewhat rickety democracy. So with that, let me just show you slides, and I'm going to try to be pretty breezy and quick here. Let's see if I can do it here. So let's see. So in principle, that's my slide presentation. Does that show the first slide? Everything okay? All right, very good. Now let me just move, you guys are in my view. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to talk about work that we've done first at Princeton University and now with my independent organization, the Electoral Innovation Lab, which is hung up its shingle and is ready to help all of you nationwide. I'm still doing research on elections at Princeton, but I've also got this spin-out organization that's really going to be free to do a lot, I hope, in the years ahead. And I just wanted to announce that you are free to read about the work at electoral-lab.org. So look, you all know about gerrymandering. You can take the same population of people where each one of these squares, a green or purple square, represents a group of people or maybe one person. And you can draw a gerrymander. If you like the green side, then you can make a map with 5 green districts. You can take the same people and cut up those pie slices from the city, and now the purples can actually win by basically distributing their pie slices around the state. And this kind of activity of gerrymandering can be done almost on the slide because of computer software. And so I just wanted to remind everyone that, in fact, it's not that hard to do, but one needs to have the motives to do it. So let me just say the optimistic thing, which is that I think unheralded in the last year, there are some pretty good things that happened. And specifically, by one way or another, good things happened in Michigan, in Virginia, in Colorado, in Pennsylvania, with either bipartisan or with nonpartisan independent redistricting commissions. It's possible to draw a map that in fact is balanced, that in fact represents many communities. There's other reforms that I hope to get into during the discussion period, where these redistricting reforms can be expanded and supercharged in their consequences by the next wave of reform, which is top 5 and ranked choice voting, which can in fact compound the benefits of redistricting. And these two ideas really go together, and there's some math involved there. But we can get into that a little bit. I know that Christian Gross is in the audience, and he's been a real leader in doing research in this domain. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Christian because I saw his name in the guest list. So first, to address David's point, I'm going to really push the glass half full argument just a little bit. This is a piece I wrote in the Atlantic shortly after the election, and I want to point out that these blue bars here are how much of the vote it took to gain control of the presidency, 48.4%. That's all that was needed because of problems in the Electoral College. 47.5% is enough for Republicans to win control of the Senate. That's of the national vote. In 2012, which is an event which I would refer to as the Great Gerrymander of 2012, it only took 46.3% of the vote to win control of the chamber. That was the most asymmetry that there had been in decades. And just as comparison, although of course we hate the gerrymanders that happened in the last cycle, Republicans needed 49.5% of the vote. And so what I would say is that in some sense, the House of Representatives is the most majoritarian chamber. Now, that kind of sounds good. We want, as David said, as John Adams pointed out, a chamber that in some way represents the whole people. There's good news and bad news here, which is that part of how this is accomplished was basically by a stalemate. And if you look in each decade, there were redistricting offenses that happened. It used to be that Democrats would do it here and there. In 2010, Republicans ran the table. In 2020, there were redistricting offenses committed by both sides, in some cases overturned by court action, in other cases not. But I would say in some ways there was more of a stalemate. And so when it comes to having a national legislature that's representative of us, things, I would say, could have turned out worse. Now, I will say, by the way, feel free to take screenshots. I'm going to show you a table that you can read about at my Substack, which is free. I don't charge money for it generally. I mean, I love donations, but you can read everything for free at the moment. If you go to samwang.substack.com, I do a tabulation of where, compared with an independent, partisan, neutral map, how many congressional seats are gained by each party. And the tabulation that we've come up with is that there was a net effect nationally that was good for Republicans. It was 5 seats, which is just enough to account for control of the chamber. But I would say that this is in comparison to the dozens of seats that there have been in the past. So, you know, it's partial progress, and one can make more progress in the next few years in Wisconsin and in Ohio, and I'll talk about that at the end. I will say that a lot of people are concerned about Moore versus Harper, which we're going to hear about in North Carolina pretty soon, and in the United States Supreme Court. I'm just going to tease you for Q&A by pointing out that actually Democrats could, in principle, win more advantage if the independent state legislature theory is approved by the Supreme Court. Now, I will say it's a radical theory that upends decades, if not centuries, of jurisprudence, and in no way is it a prudent move to make with the Constitution. But a cynical person might say, well, you know what? If it helps Democrats, then that's actually contrary to who we've been hearing is in favor of the theory. So I just want to throw that out there, invite you to read the Washington Post piece, and hopefully we'll come back to this. But the point is that I actually am quite an optimist about Moore versus Harper, and glad to get into a discussion with my co-panelists on that. Okay, so let me just briefly say ways in which citizens can win in 2023 and beyond. And three targets that I think are ripe are Wisconsin, Ohio, and Georgia. First off, in Wisconsin is the site of, by some metrics, the most extreme legislative gerrymander in the country. And I want to pause here and say that we talk about congressional power, but people at the level of state legislatures have no recourse. If you get gerrymandered in Wisconsin, it is of no use that the other party has gerrymandered in Illinois. And so state legislatures are absolutely critical for issues having to do with how your money's spent, reproductive rights, books in schools, guns. A host of policies are set at the local level. And in the case of Wisconsin, Wisconsin has, by our metrics, the most extreme legislative map in the country. It has the most partisan bias, and this map gets an F. This map was implemented, not necessarily voluntarily, but the Wisconsin State Supreme Court was quite cautious and ended up implementing this map. It gets an F. And there's a state Supreme Court election on April 4th that has the possibility of really changing the judicial scene in Wisconsin. And this candidate here, this liberal judge, Janet Protasewicz, may in fact hold the keys in her hand if she wins that race. And so I would say that the April 4th election in Wisconsin is the single most important election when it comes to democracy in the United States. It's the single most important election of 2023. And so that's an example where people can make a difference. And you have to look for these points of leverage. Ohio is a state where they're looking at possible redistricting reform in the next year or two. That's important. And finally, I want to, in the final minute or two, talk about Georgia. Georgia is a place where I think the most leverage can be found from actually thinking about reforming the primary system. And while our topic tonight is redistricting, these two topics go with one another. Let me show you why. Fundamentally, there's different ways to build fairness and competition. One is to draw competitive districts. Another is to change the rules by which people are elected. This is now a tabulation of competitive districts in Congress. This is there were 33 such seats in 2012, which is not very many considering that's out of 435 seats. In 2020, there was an increase in that number of competitive seats, 54, and then this last election, 47. So this is not really a particularly responsive chamber we have here because it's still barely 1 out of 10 seats. But let me just point out to you that, in fact, a voting rule reform called Top 5 and ranked choice voting can, in principle, increase the number of competition by a factor of 2, by perhaps doubling the number of competitive seats, simply by giving voters an option to pick a third candidate or to rank their first, second, and third choices. There's a lot to say about the Georgia primary system, but I think this is a case where Republicans in control of the legislature could be persuaded to implement primary reform, and it might be a way to empower voters in Georgia. It's happened in Alaska. It's under consideration in Nevada. And I would say that Georgia is a place where one could consider it happening. And fundamentally, I'm not going to show you why this is, but I'm just going to show you that we've done mathematical simulations that show that, in fact, it's possible to take into account these people who do not fall easily into either a left leaning group or a right leaning group. This little hump, these two big humps are left and right leaning voters. This third hump is call it a neither group. And ranked choice voting gives this third group the possibility of either being with one group or with the other group. And it allows voters to escape the polarization trap. Glad to talk about this, as I said, during discussion. So the point being to just say that I think that, look, repairing democracy is tough. It's hard work. It involves a lot of setbacks and involves a lot of, ability to be angry at bad outcomes. But it also involves finding leverage where you can. And I would say that there's a lot of work ahead, and there's a few bright spots in terms of achieving the next round of reform.
Sam, thank you for that. I love the scorecard, and I love the optimism in terms of the other mechanisms we should be looking at. I know ranked choice voting and Georgia's runoffs have been an issue in this legislative session. I don't know if we're going to make progress this time, but fascinating ideas on how to work around some of the gerrymandering issues that we do have. Let's turn the floor over to Michael Lee and get his take on the key question and looking forward.
Sure. I think going into this election, a lot of people thought that Democrats would lose a lot of seats. Historically, the president's party in the first midterm of his presidency, the party loses on average 26 seats, sometimes more. And I think many people were thinking, given the economy, given inflation and everything, that Democrats would lose a bunch of seats. And that didn't happen, of course. And that's led some people to adopt the narrative like, well, these maps are, gosh, maybe not so bad. Maybe like everything netted out and it was fair overall. I'm not sure that's quite right. I think part of, when you draw maps, part of what you try to do is you try to predict the politics of the future. And if you get it right, then your gerrymanders stick and they work. But sometimes you get it wrong. And I think, in the cycle, these maps simply weren't designed for, one big thing that happened, which was Dobbs, which, nobody, when they were drawing these maps in 2021 said, like, what happens if the Supreme Court overturns Roe versus Wade in a very controversial opinion, and that opinion leaks beforehand. And so I think that sort of really, did upend things. And, Democrats in some ways got a lucky break politically, even if the decision was, in their view, very horrible. The other thing I do think, I do think it's also important to not just look at it as a national story. I do think you have to look at it sort of as a regional story and a very state-specific story. And if you look at it, as people have alluded, there weren't many competitive districts overall. Only about 30 or so were very competitive. 3/4 of those, by the way, were drawn by commissions or court. So if you were in a competitive district, you were most likely in a district drawn by commission or court. But if you break it down by region, there were sharp differences. And, in the South in particular, which is the country's fastest growing and most populous region, only 1% of districts were competitive. And those happened to be districts in Virginia and North Carolina, which were drawn by courts or under court supervision. And so, with the exception of one additional district in Texas. And so, the South really didn't have a lot of competition. And, it particularly didn't have a lot of competition in the suburbs, right? If you think about the country as a whole, the cities tend to be various shades of blue, rural areas tend to be very red. Across the country, the one place where you still do actually have competition is in the suburbs of the country. And in places where you had fairly drawn maps, like in Orange County in California, where the commission kept communities together, you had a lot of competition. And, Democrats have won those districts, Republicans have won them back in the succeeding election, and it's gone back and forth. But you've also, because these districts were sort of naturally drawn, and by the way, most people of color in the country's metro areas now live in the suburbs, not in the cities. And so, if you keep suburban communities together, you actually end up with fairly diverse districts, not majority districts, but very diverse districts. And what you saw in Orange County is districts that had large Asian populations, large Latino populations, and both parties went out and they recruited candidates who would appeal to those communities. They actively opened up outreach centers, in the Vietnamese community, in the Chinese community, and they competed for the new multiracial America that's emerging, right? And that didn't happen in other parts of the country where you had partisan control of map drawing and where suburban communities were broken up, oftentimes joined with rural communities in order to sort of create, a safe gerrymandered district. And there, nobody competed, right? Like people didn't have to compete for that. And Georgia has a prime example where Lucy McBath's district was broken up. In Fort Bend County in Texas, which is one of the most competitive districts in the country in 2018 and 2020. That district got broken up, and a bunch of Asian voters got moved to a district in Houston. They got backfilled with rural white voters, and all Republicans had to do is speak to their base, right? They didn't have to go out and try to win their fair share of Asian voters or Latino voters or Black voters. And so, I think, you see that sort of thing. So did gerrymandering have an effect? I think absolutely. If you sort of look at it using the standards in the Freedom to Vote Act, in just 4 states, there were 11 to 13 fewer Biden districts, right? There are districts that Joe Biden won in 2020 than there were under under the current maps, and that's really remarkable. And those 4 states are Florida, Georgia, Ohio, and Texas, right? And so if you just look at that, I know people have talked about sort of like, oh, well, how does this match up with the national share of the vote? I do think you have to like break it down and look at it at a state level. Because, in those states, you would expect under maps that comply with the Freedom to Vote Act standards about 41 to 43 Biden districts. Instead, you have 30 under the old maps, or 36. So the old maps weren't particularly fair, but you go from 36 to 30 when really there should be 41 to 43. And that's just an example. So, and it's because Republicans only hold a 5-seat majority in the House, it's really not hard to count to figure out many different alternative histories where Democrats managed to maintain the House, right? And so, are these maps like the worst ever? No, but are they, fair maps? They're absolutely not fair. So, look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Michael. And I'll just quickly summarize what I think we heard. We heard a lot from our 3 esteemed experts here. It sounds to me like the answer, in some sense, is yes, the maps affected the election. There's many ways to look at it, right? If I just listen to the scorecards that you 3 presented, it could be somewhere around 5 or 6 districts, but it just really depends on how you look at it, and it's a very state-by-state question. Sam, I thought your comment that we've gerrymandered our way to a stalemate is right on, in terms of, we've now got this very narrowly divided Congress and it flips back and forth. But because of, both parties being involved in this gamesmanship, as David told us earlier, we kind of gerrymandered our way to a stalemate. But when you look at individual states, you can see harm to voters, right? And I like the idea that there's ways out of this. So I wanted to just raise one question before we get to the audience questions, and that was we've seen other reports written from folks like the Upshot at New York Times and 538 and others, and a recent thing from the Brookings Institution that kind of mirrored, Sam, your points around the whole idea of we have a fairly majoritarian system where you've got a narrow range of Republican vote share, and you've got a narrow range in the Republican Congress now. It seems to me that what I heard you say was when you break it down and look at each individual state, you can still see issues, right? And you can't just conclude based on that one metric that everything's fair, because there's a lot of unfairness kind of baked into the system, and voters are being disrupted. Our 6th district in Georgia was disrupted, as you mentioned, Michael, around the Lucy McBath district, right? So voters' voices have been stolen to make this game workable by both sides, right? And so I was curious what, if you guys have read those articles and had any reaction to those ideas from around, the idea that the majoritarian view, I think, Sam, you've already said, it's like, it's one way to look at it, but it doesn't tell the whole story.
I mean, let me just say that it's fortunate that we have a House of Representatives that's roughly majoritarian, but it's kind of this weird rough justice where things balanced more than one could have feared. And so the way I'd put it is, it's like William Gibson said, the future is here, it's just not distributed evenly. We have competition in elections. It's just not distributed equally. Over half of the competitive races in Congress were concentrated in about 10 states. Mm-hmm. And so we have a situation where millions of people have very little say at the federal level. And so for this reason, it is a critical task at a local level to increase competition, both to improve federal elections in various ways. But again, I really have to emphasize that I think that we all have shiny object problem, which is that, look, of course we care about congressional representation. It's why I got interested in this in the first place. It's why I wrote my 2013 New York Times piece. But the thing is, there's local representation that matters. And so there, I, for one, am extremely focused on finding ways to build competition both locally and nationally. So, the offenses are there. Some people have their left eye blacked out. Other people have their right eye blacked out. And okay, hooray.
Right. And that whole theme of competition, I thought all three of you hit on it, which was, competition has been narrowed a lot. We've seen it in our state, but I think across the country, I think, David, you were citing some amazing statistics around how few competitive districts we have. And that's true state legislatively here as well as congressional. And I think that's a big harm to the voters, is when you don't really have a true choice. What percent of voters have a real choice when they step into the ballot box?
Sure. I think competitive districts are important. I don't think they're always the be all end all, because we have in some ways sorted ourselves, and we're only going to have so many competitive, every district can't be competitive. And if you were to draw every district to be competitive, you would see some wild gerrymanders to make that happen. And there's some interesting political science that suggests more voters would be upset, right? Because you'd have all these 50.1 to 49.9 districts. So it's not a question of having every district be competitive. To me, the larger question is, do we have maps that are responsive to swings in the electorate? And, at the state legislative level, in swing states, do maps correspond to, the basic partisan breakdown of a state? If there are issues that change the electorate, whether it's Dobbs, we're on the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, whether it's something like that, we're watching another bank meltdown, right? So whether it's something like the 2008 economic meltdown, can an issue forced in a changing electorate, does that result in a change of power? Is a change of power possible? I think that we're early on these maps, but it seems to me that the answer so far suggests probably not. I think these maps are likely to get worse in a couple of crucial states over the course of the next couple of years, in Ohio and North Carolina. And I think we just can't emphasize enough what the role of the U.S. Supreme Court has been here in making this situation dramatically worse for American voters. Whether you're talking about the Shelby County case and the end of preclearance in so many of these states where maps would have had to have been checked over, and they would likely not have passed muster. I don't think the commission map in Arizona would have passed muster. I don't think Texas would have passed muster. Certainly there's a handful of states where that may well have changed. And then what we're seeing now on Section 2, and Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina. This is a fraught moment.
Yep.
Can I just respond to the question that you threw out there?
Yeah, absolutely.
I do think, like, when you look at these pieces by Upshot and everything, I go back to the idea, these, nobody expected Dobbs, right? To sort of factor in this election. And I'll give you an example from last decade, right? There were gerrymanders that came close to collapsing, or in some places that actually collapsed, because when people drew maps in 2011, they sort of like were, predicting the politics of the future, but nobody foresaw the election of Donald Trump, right? And what Donald Trump would do in pushing a lot of white suburban voters, especially white college-educated suburban women, into the Democratic camp, right? And so that upended, the gerrymanders, because it didn't sort of like, it didn't work, right? Dobbs had a similar effect this cycle, but we don't know whether like the effect of Dobbs is a permanent thing or a blip. Are people just mad this cycle and then they get over it, or is this a permanent realignment? And I think there's evidence that goes both ways, and in fact probably argues more that there is an educational realignment. But we don't know. So like the fact that the maps turned out fair under circumstances, or fairer under circumstances that people weren't anticipating when they drew them, I think like that, you have to take that into account. Like these maps weren't designed for that. And I do think I also just want to respond to something that David said. I mean, I do think like, I want to stress again, like, most people of color live in the suburbs, not in the metro areas, and not in the cities and metro areas. And so like in those areas, like, our toolbox is really thin, right? Like it's hard to draw Section 2 districts in those areas. Section 5 also doesn't really sort of have a lot of sway, even if it were still in place. And so really we need to think about new things, and Sam mentioned, I think multi-member districts, other types of ways of electing people, all of which could, sort of open up fair representation, because the real frontier for fair representation is sort of like ensuring that the suburbs are competitive where they can be, like they sort of like keep communities together, like, ensuring that, and by the way, 56% of all Americans live in the suburbs, and the percentage I think is actually higher in the South, because the South is very suburban. Like nobody lived in the South until like 50 years ago, and then like everybody moved to the suburbs, right? And so I do think like that's like really, really important. And so like, even if we fully restored the voting rights act, it doesn't get us to where we need to be.
I'm going to just leap in and synthesize a little bit of what Michael and David have said here. David mentioned that there could be something bad happening in Ohio and North Carolina. I will say just cynically, I'm just going to say, sure, you got a problem there. In North Carolina, there are some serious problems, and I think that it's difficult to imagine a good solution there. And I hate to say it, but that's the case. In Ohio can amend its constitution. And I'm just going to say something about federal precedent and the Voting Rights Act and Section 5 and all that stuff. When Rucho versus Common Cause came down, I'm just going to be really frank. We're among friends here. My interest in constitutional law and federal courts as a means of achieving good outcomes switched off like a light. Okay, like I used to be really interested in constitutional law and like read what all those really smart people said. And I just at this point, I've just become indifferent to the subject. I mean, of course, I'm interested the same way that I slow down when I see a car wreck. Like I look at car wrecks on the highway. I can't help it. I look. But fundamentally, Ohio has the possibility of change. And if you want to make change in the next couple of years, then a constitutional amendment that is approved by voters is probably the way to get there. And
Ohio voters did that, and the state Supreme Court in Ohio tried to enforce it, and the politicians in Ohio ignored it because.
Okay, so sure, of course, okay, yeah.
So this idea that
that's
going to save us.
That sucked. Okay, but the thing is, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, won't get fooled again, as George W. Bush said. And so the thing is, it is true that there's a loophole. It is also true that there may be new energy to fix it. And, there are no guarantees that it's going to get fixed next time. But I agree with you in full. I mean, I would say that David and I are in what one would call vigorous, violent agreement. That
you could do California or Michigan in Ohio, right?
Yes, exactly.
A robust reform. Yeah,
exactly.
Right.
Exactamente, muchacho.
Right.
Or amigo. Sorry.
In the interest of time, I think I want to take some questions from the audience. So I'm going to introduce Janet here, our host, and Janet, you've been collecting some questions, so let's present some of those. I think I've been watching a little bit. So Janet, I'm going to let you pick
Yeah,
out some of the key questions and present those.
You all have already been responding to some of them. I think the kind of the overall theme, I would say, of the questions is where do we go from here and what kinds of reforms are possible? Not just necessarily commissions or something directly for gerrymandering, but some of the other pieces that that you all have mentioned, like ranked choice voting and any other structural kinds of things that we can pin some hopes on and maybe add to our advocacy toolkit.
Well, I'll let people speak to the ideas for reforms, but I do think, speaking as a Southerner, my home state is Texas, although I'm in New York now. Ultimately, I do think like you have to have some level of federal reform, whether that's amending the Constitution in some ways, which there could be a gerrymandering constitutional amendment. So, the momentum could be there, or Congress could pass something when there's a reform-minded majority again. Those are hard lifts, but I don't think that you actually change the South, organically. I think because it's not, you can't do ballot initiatives there except in Florida, and so it's really hard. So I do think there has to be an effort, and the Freedom to Vote Act was a great bill. Congress should pick it back up the next time they have an opportunity, but you do need some kind of federal reform. Unless you sort of and maybe in states like Texas and Georgia, the political winds shift enough that Democrats sort of like win the governorships and creates a different dynamic, but absent that, it's hard to see state level reform.
I think that's right. I think I would plus one all of that. California and Michigan style commissions. When commissions are properly built, we see the results that they deliver. I think that there's other states that are almost entirely blue or entirely red, where commissions don't necessarily work as well. I'm talking to you from Massachusetts, where it's pretty much going to be a 9-0 state, no matter how you draw the map, even though there's plenty of Republicans here and plenty of Republican governors elected over the last 30 years. And, I think that if you did have something more multi-member and proportional and used ranked choice, that the kind of fairer maps that you would see in places like Oklahoma and Kansas and Tennessee, but then also in Connecticut and Massachusetts and Oregon, you would get fairer maps in states that are dominated but by one party or another. I also I also think that this would be extraordinarily helpful approach when you look at what I fear is likely to come from the court in the Milligan case, that we're going to have to be thinking about new ways to ensure that a multiracial nation can be a multiracial democracy, and we're going to have other fixes there. But I think in addition to all of the structural fixes that we're talking about, and I keep hitting this hammer, I don't think that we're going to have political reform until we also think about Supreme Court reform. I think that we have to look at what the court has done in the last decade plus, honestly, that it's been a wrecking crew for voting rights, and that almost anything that we are talking about and likely to come up with here this evening could simply be undone by a court that has effectively created its own statute on equal sovereignty among states in the Shelby County case, that has effectively rewritten Section 2 in the Brnovich case. However, Justice Alito decided to turn the clock back to 1982 and install his own test for the one that Congress wrote. And as long as we have a court that is going to do that, and until we try to fix and reform the court, that a lot of what we do will be moot.
My new name for them is the U.S. Extreme Court when they issue some of these decisions. So you can use that.
Professor Wang, I know you had mentioned earlier that you wanted to maybe cover some of the reforms possible.
Well, we've already touched upon them. I would say, as I was just saying in the chat, that at some level we need to take a portfolio approach. There's short-term and there's long-term reform. And I would say there's immediate term. Immediate term, the Wisconsin State Supreme Court race. Short-term, state ballot initiatives and other Supreme Court races. Things like what Michael Lee is just suggesting with California and Michigan style commissions in Ohio, or perhaps passing city-level approval voting or ranked choice voting. And then long-term reform requires taking a long view. Now, long-term, I get to be visionary and say, you know what, long-term, the pendulum's going to swing. One major party that really likes some of these warping actions to our democracy may fissure, and people need to be ready for it. Long-term, we're going to get off the knife edge and be no longer 50-50 because you can only stay on the knife edge for a few decades at a time. So long-term, we have to be ready as citizens to implement structural reform. But the key is to always keep straight in your mind, you're doing something short-term, medium-term, long-term. It's like my budget. Short-term, do I have enough money to buy lunch today? Medium-term, am I going to make the rent this month? Long-term, am I ready for retirement? And always you have to be thinking about short-term, medium-term, long-term. And, you know, like I said, I'm a data nerd and an optimist. And so I keep on hoping at each level to find the one place where I can just say, okay, you know what? If we go to Ohio and pour a little bit of water, then the fire might go out. If we go over here in Wisconsin. And so the difficulty is you have to just keep all the details in your head. And then, you know, locally where you live, find the detail that works for your state, your locality, and do not let go of it.
So the formula is kind of different state by state, is what you're saying, Sam.
Yes.
Each state, you got to look at what are your circumstances and what are you able to try in the short term, and then obviously think of the long term. I mean, you know, I know Georgia better than any other state, and we've got our issues, right? But we are learning. When we saw the Ohio Commission kind of get stalled, we said, if we're going to write a commission rule, we're going to write one of those. Let's learn from that experience, right? As we're trying. So it sounds like it's a state by state battle, which makes sense given that's the power to change this stuff is fundamentally more at the state legislature than in Congress. Though we would love to see the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act and in all its wonderful provisions, but we that may be a while to wait for that. I know we're at the top of the hour. If we have additional questions, Janet, maybe our guest could stay for a little bit.
I think we have covered really the main ones related to this topic. We could maybe ask for them to weigh in on one more Georgia-related topic. We'd be interested in what your knowledge is of this across the country, and that is in our legislative session this time, the piece on redistricting that has been front and center has been local redistricting, because our state legislators actually draw or have to approve local maps for county commissions and county school boards, and there has, needless to say, been some challenges in particularly Democratic counties or changing demographic counties where there's been a difference of opinion on those maps. Thoughts on that, kind of the national picture related to local redistricting?
I think local redistricting is absolutely vital at so many levels. Georgia's a little bit weird in the way that maps get produced. Usually it is actually at the local level, but it's something that people don't pay enough attention to, that not enough resources are devoted to. And, you know, we have a report that will be issued sometime this year, actually looking at local representation in Georgia for people of color. And there are huge gaps, like, you know, especially, you know, in some of these smaller and more rural counties. And, you know, that's like a huge, you know, those are places where state legislators come from and members of Congress come from.
I'm going to say something strategic for those of you who are legally minded or strategically minded. I think of someone like Michael Lee as being an intellectual leader at a national level and having to worry about federal doctrine, federal law. And I'm just going to add to what he said and say that the one nice thing about state and local reform is you have fewer competitors It's a smaller playing field. It's, you know, all the top law schools sucked all the top minds into constitutional law, and that's like the queen of all the legal disciplines. And meanwhile, turns out if you want to work on city ward design, no offense to the people working on that, but it's a smaller talent pool wherever you live. And that means that there are ways to win at that level. And, you know, and there's, I'm just going to put in a pitch for, there's an election law clinic at Harvard Law School that Nick Stephanopoulos and Ruth Greenwood have. And they are very interested in helping locally. It's just a different ballgame. And reform is always tough, but there are ways in which local reform can be gratifying and in some ways achievable. But, you know, you got to work the angles. And so, you know, it's more like, I don't know, it's like state highways is versus interstate highways. It's like that.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks for that input. And we do have some folks on the call with us today that have really been leaders in having this discussion, this session. So with that, I think we will have to end the evening. We want to really give our heartfelt thanks to Michael Lee, Sam Wang, and David Daley for joining us. This was the all-star panel that we had hoped for, and you all said yes, and we were thrilled to have this conversation with you this evening. And remember, folks, that we have recorded this, so we will be making this available after the meeting for you to be able to share as well. We don't have a date for our next town hall meeting. The legislative session is winding down, thank goodness. But we will be watching, obviously, these Supreme Court hearings and be coming back to you soon. So watch for announcements in our regular newsletter about the upcoming town hall. There should be a link in the chat to evaluate this meeting. We'll also be sending it out afterwards. We always appreciate your thoughts on how it went, suggestions for future town halls. And as always, we appreciate your donations. We are an all-volunteer nonprofit organization dependent on your donations for bringing programs like this to you. So with that, we'll say good evening. And again, thank you. And thank you especially to our panelists and to our guests from outside of Georgia for joining us this evening. Thanks.